This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From custom domains to beautiful websites using their easily customizable templates that you can have up and running in minutes, e-commerce, email and email marketing, SEO, analytics, and scheduling, Squarespace does it all and has done it for us for the last 6 years. If you are a small to mid-sized business in any industry, Squarespace is the place to go for all of your website needs. Hop over to www.squarespace.com/Hugh for a free trial. And if you like what you see and want to move forward, receive 10% off your first order by using the discount code Hugh at checkout. Thanks, Squarespace. Hey everybody, I'm Hugh Brownstone for Three Blind Men and an Elephant. And today I want to give you a quick update on Zeiss's ZX1, a camera that was announced back in 2018, only began shipping in late 2020, and which I've now had in hand for a bit with the latest firmware update. Let me begin by saying, as I have in previous videos, I'll put a link to them in the show notes down below, that the ZX1 is a unique, high-concept camera conceived by a legendary brand, lovely in hand, and capable of beautiful imagery, sharp, vibrant, richly detailed, like this. It is an ultra-modern, minimalist, rangefinder-style 37.5 megapixel full-frame camera with built-in EVF and integrated high-performance 35mm f2 lens designed by Zeiss that nonetheless pays homage to the classic exposure triangle with dedicated controls for shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, and little else. No joystick, no D-pad, no card slots for that matter, relying instead on an internal half-terabyte solid-state memory, no ports other than a single non-sealed USB-C port. There's only one function button, which I actually don't mind that much, but you can only assign one of something less than half a dozen different functions to it. Some of us may find this objectionable. It's when you turn the camera around that the high concept suddenly fully reveals itself with a large curved rear screen taking up the entire back of the camera. Once you turn it on, a touch interface as close to that of a smartphone as I've ever seen on a camera with Lightroom and Instagram preloaded, that the real show begins. This, connectivity and an integration of apps designed to offer the shortest distance between shooting, editing, and sharing on one device in real time, shoot, edit, share is their tagline, is the camera's radical point of departure, which, for those of you who know me, does much to explain why I was enthralled with the idea of it when we attended the launch in Cologne, Germany 3 years ago. Except, one, it turns out you do still need your phone or access to Wi-Fi for a secure, hold that thought, internet connection. And two, it turns out my workflow is sufficiently different from the ZX1's sweet spot of Lightroom and Instagram integration that it is irrelevant to me. Though your mileage may vary, and that's fine. The thing of it is, when I shoot, the joy comes from entering a state of flow on the street when everything else, including any thoughts about editing or sharing, simply vanish. It's only afterward, when I'm back at home or in a hotel room down from the high of the day, that I go through the day's haul with a more distanced eye and begin curating what I've done, inevitably on a screen at least as big as my 11-inch iPad Pro, more often on my 13-inch MacBook Pro, most often on my 27-inch iMac or 32-inch BenQ monitor. Maybe at that point, though usually later, I edit those images. Sometime after that, I'll curate again and select images that I want to share on Insta, one image at a time. This process can take days or weeks, and I like it that way. Which is not to say one cannot accomplish the same set of activities on the ZX1. You can, but in my book, there is simply no substitutes for screen real estate and temporal distance from the shoot to get the best of what one has done. In other words, again, for me, or you, if you are at all like me, the shortest distance between intent and execution begins with being out on the street, knowing in the moment what and how I want to shoot, and ends with the actual capture. The back end of that process works well enough for me, using Lightroom, Creative Cloud across my laptop, desktop, iPad, and iPhone, that I don't need to improve upon it. Other than those occasional black hole messages, long sync times, the subscription business model. Don't get me started. All of which is to say that while the ZX1 is path-breaking, whether or not the ergonomics and or workflow are right for you remain uncertain, a function of how you work and how you actually respond to the camera given the way you work. I encourage you to look at my previous videos on the camera for a more detailed look at what that means. But what is certain, and this firmware update is an encouraging start with face detection autofocus and the ability now to check focus of raw images at 1:1 magnification during playback, is that the company needs to make its way through the kind of significant punch list inevitable for any camera breaking new ground. But even with these updates, autofocus and viewing during playback are not state of the art, which, to be fair and to which I just alluded, didn't stop me from getting the shots I wanted. I liked the camera. And while some of those punch list items may be amenable to future firmware updates, things like cleaning up the initial connection process to Adobe Lightroom CC when a user starts up the camera for the very first time, or making that connection process easier and more robust in subsequent use of the camera if the user chooses or inadvertently misses that initial connection, or managing the process when attempting to use a non-secure network like what one usually finds in hotels. Other items like giving the aperture ring its own distinct feel so that it is easy to distinguish between it and the focus ring in the lens barrel, or improving the weather sealing, or reducing boot time, will require hardware changes. But the biggest issue the ZX1 faces is the competitive landscape, which today looks very different than it did when the ZX1 was first contemplated, perhaps, more than a decade ago. Even before Sony first launched their 24-megapixel full-frame RX1 rangefinder-style camera in 2012, because, right, it sported an integrated Zeiss-designed 35mm f2 sonar design. At that time, the RX1 was a revelation and stood alone. Its nearest competitor, if you could call it that, had been announced in 2010 and began shipping in 2011, but it was a 12.3-megapixel APS-C censored consumer camera with more than its share of teething problems, though with firmware and hardware updates, it would eventually become a classic in its own right. Yeah, I'm talking about Fujifilm's X100 series. And that really was it. Though, I ought to point out, for additional context, that in 2012, Apple's latest iPhone was the 3GS with a newly updated 3-megapixel camera. And the photo sharing app Instagram, only 2 years old at the time, had just been acquired by Facebook for $1 billion. Hold that thought. The original 24-megapixel Leica Q wouldn't be released until 2015, 3 years later, but when it hit big, even with Sony announcing the 42-megapixel RX1R that same year. The ergos and industrial design were stunning. It's integrated and image-stabilized Leica Summilux 28 1.7 with real manual focus override and macro capability was stunning. The build quality was stunning. But as I said earlier, Zeiss didn't announce its entry into this space for another 3 years, and then it took another 2 years for the ZX1 to actually reach the market. A lot happened in between. Leica's massively updated 47.5-megapixel full-frame Q2 was released into the market a year before the ZX1 for $5,000, a cool grand less than the ZX1's price today, with 4 years' worth of feedback and fine-tuning evident from improved weather sealing to new battery EVF and more. Within days of the ZX1 finally becoming available in late 2020, Leica announced and put into reviewers' hands the Q2 monochrome for 6K. While its high ISO performance and rich black and white tonality set the monochrome apart from the original Q2, it shared the same resolution as its full-color sibling, meaning both were capable of cropping into a 35mm field of view and retain 30 megapixels worth of information, negating much of the ZX1's advantage for those of us who prefer that 35mm field of view. By February of 2020, Fujifilm had released their $1,400 X100V with the same outstanding 26.2 megapixel sensor with phase detect autofocus found in the company's flagship X-T4, an articulating screen, An improved 23mm f2, same field of view as the 35 on the ZX1, the result basically of a decade's worth of feedback and fine-tuning. While we're talking APS-C, let's talk about Leica's $3,100 24-megapixel interchangeable lens CL, announced a year before Zeiss announced the ZX1, because in spite of most reviewers' lukewarm reception to it, I think the CL is magnificent, and I bought one, inspired as much by the camera's pedigree as its performance. The TL lens line is extraordinary, and though the battery is nothing to write home about, and it doesn't have IBIS, the size, ergos, industrial design, build quality, and image quality are, once again, spectacular. But fair enough, you might not consider either of these little guys direct competitors. I disagree, but that's okay. Reasonable people can. So, let's get back to full frame. Sony announced their $1,800 24-megapixel full-frame rangefinder style interchangeable lens A7C in September 2020 and began shipping shortly thereafter. It was a notable design departure from previous alpha cameras with nary a custom button in sight, using essentially the same sensor and Z battery of the A7 III with even better autofocus, heat management, and, in addition to IBIS, the kind of gyroscopic data for post-production stabilization found on the twice-the-price A7S III. Though, yeah, okay, same mortifyingly complex menu system with incomplete touch interface as the A7 III. Sony, however, has also released an excellent $750 35 1.8 and even more performant $1,400 1.4 to go with it. Sigma has released a comparable but more keenly priced $900 1.4 in FE mount, and Tamron has released a $200 35 2.8 FE lens with OEM-level autofocus performance and sharpness belied by its price and middling build quality. I understand if you assert that the A7C is not a direct ZX1 competitor either, but let's put it this way. If one has the budget for a small, brilliant $6,000 camera with an emphasis on industrial design, it ought to be a lot better than an even smaller, less than half the price, brilliant camera in its own right, which also has pretensions, at least, to industrial design and happens to be much more buttoned up, a function, once again, of years of feedback from the field. Then again, you could compare the ZX1 to the 2.5 times as expensive GFX 100 with 32 to 64 zoom. Of course, they're not quite from the same angle or quite the same object size. These were shot on two completely different days, and the GFX 100 was shot at ISO 400, while the ZX1 was shot at ISO 100. Still, wow, the ZX1 holds its own. Sigma's $1,900 24-megapixel FP, released in 2019, is much easier for me to set aside as a direct competitor to the ZX1 because it was originally pitched as a video-centric modular system camera. But it suddenly became a much bigger blip on the radar screen when the company released a $2,500 61-megapixel EVF optional version of it, the FPL, earlier this year. Pair it with Sigma's lovely $640 35mm f2 prime, and you have a camera that is also far less expensive than the ZX1, also with a unique design vocabulary, but with far more resolution. Although, to be fair, the FPL has teething problems of its own, including significantly worse autofocus performance, has to be said, no integrated EVF, and ergonomics that, well, I kind of like them. They defy proper description. Also, to be fair, you might expect these kinds of teething problems because, like Zeiss, Sigma is first and foremost a lens manufacturer, and the FPL, like the ZX1, is an ambitious camera with a limited installed base to provide feedback. Which, circling back to perhaps the single biggest change of all since 2010, is where smartphones are, more than a decade after Zeiss may have first contemplated their own full-frame camera with integrated lens, with billions of them sold. It's not just that the latest iPhone 12 Pro now sports three 12-megapixel sensor lens units rather than the 3GS's single 3-megapixel unit. It's not just that Sony's latest Xperia 1 Model 3 or Mark III has embraced folded optics, or that we now have 5G rolling out. It's that the trajectory of smartphone technology will continue to dramatically outpace that of more traditional cameras without asking consumers to spend anything for a dedicated camera, because how many of us are going to print larger than 13 by 19 or use interchangeable lenses. Not that many. And, oh yeah, according to Adam Mosseri, Instagram CEO, Instagram is no longer a photo app anyway. It's enough to make some of us recoil from digital altogether. Which, come to think of it, if what you actually want is a second or third camera from a legendary name to inspire you, sweep you off your feet and away from the workaday world of increasingly similar and uber-performant digital cameras with indistinct personalities and overwhelming complexity, well, there's always Leica's $5,300 body only, 35mm film only, manual focus only, not even a light meter on it. You have to pay separately for the lens. MA. Though, of course, at that point, no autofocus for you. Let's wrap it up this way. I like the ZX1. It is significantly smaller and lighter than my Leica SL2. A lovely camera in hand on the street with wonderful image quality. Zeiss has done something bold and laudable, and I applaud them for it. The irony, for me, is that I'd like the camera even more without the Lightroom and Instagram integration, without the overhead of Android, heck, without video. I'd trade off all of that in a heartbeat for better autofocus, full weather sealing, higher resolution, image stabilization of some sort, small changes to the software interface so that I wouldn't keep accidentally swiping the exposure compensation icon for a little less. Put differently and less personally, even with the ZX1's excellent image quality, unique industrial design, brand heritage, clarity of purpose, and the company's commitments to firmware updates on the one hand, and allowing for teething pains that, again, any truly novel camera would have on the other, the ZX1's future remains clouded by three existential questions. 1. Is the underlying premise of shoot, edit, share workflow brilliant or too little too late, superseded by the evolution of smartphones and camera manufacturers' awareness of the need to make their apps work more seamlessly and intuitively with them, or perhaps a simple preference by most people for the more atomized workflow of yore? 2. And I really hadn't thought about this until Nikon released their $1,200 APS-C ZFC with 28mm lens. Is the design vocabulary of the ZX1, that blend of minimalism and modernism I personally so enjoy, again, brilliant, or simply the wrong vocabulary at a moment when the smartphone generation is hungering for a much more retro mechanical feel? 3. Finally, even if the answers to the first two questions are, yes, it's brilliant, is the $6,000 price the right price? Is it justified? How does it compare to the value offered by current competitors? For some of us, the answer to this last set of questions reduces to, yes, I'm happy to pay for it. But I suspect, for more of us who have the wherewithal and inclination to spend that kind of money, the answer will be no, or at least not yet. After less than a year in the market, I believe Zeiss is already at a crossroads with the ZX1. I think the company needs to apply the kind of out-of-the-box thinking which created the ZX1 in the first place to its financial and product management calculations going forward. I think it fair to say that they need to dramatically speed up the process of fine-tuning and debugging the camera. I think it fair to say, and those of you who know me know that I don't begrudge camera companies high prices per se, that the current price is not consistent with the value of the camera, almost however anyone defines it, as it now stands. I think it fair to say that Zeiss ought to reconsider what the competition is today and how it is priced, what is essential versus what has been superseded by events, and whether or not maintaining that price and pace of evolution is the path to a breakout success or a slow descent into irrelevance, which I suppose they already have. I am rooting for Zeiss, but if they've concluded they're doing just fine, I fear for the success of the ZX1. I'd rather they decontent it, remove Lightroom, Instagram, the Android operating system, actually maybe give it a model name change to go with it, and drop the price by $2,000. Call it a ZX1B. Sell the original alongside it at 6K if they must, and see what happens. This might give them the maneuvering room in the meantime to spec up and debug a ZX2 with high performance autofocus, a higher resolution sensor, a higher resolution, higher magnification finder while we're at it, proper weather sealing, instant boot up, maybe IBIS or IS in the lens itself, maybe a series of ZXs of different focal lengths, or simply rip through the current ZX1's punch list, which in either case might justify the current price. We'll see soon enough. This episode was brought to you by Squarespace. For all of your website needs, Squarespace is the place to go. Get your free, no strings attached 14-day trial at www.squarespace.com/hue. And if at the end you decide you really love it and are ready to go for it, save 10% by using the discount code HUE at checkout. Thanks, Squarespace. If you like what you've seen here today, please give a thumbs up, subscribe, join the conversation below because this is an incredible audience. If you'd like a copy of our Streets of New York, the book, head over to www.3bmep.com/books. If you'd like to schedule a one-on-one video session with me for a portfolio review, explore or hone your artistic voice, select gear, and more, sign up at www.3bmep.com/booking. Finally, consider supporting our work by using our no-cost-to-you affiliate links down below, picking up some official Three Blind Men and an Elephant swag at 3bmep.threadless.com, sending coffee money via PayPal, or best of all, join us as a patron over at Patreon. However you choose to support us, as always, we thank you for it.